Welcome to Readara. Today we are interviewing Erika Rappaport, the author of A Thirst for Empire, How Tea Shaped the Modern World. Tea is one of the most popular and widely used and traded commodities in the world, but people may not realize that over centuries the tea has been globalized and how the profits from its growth and sales funded wars and fueled colonization. And its cultivation brought about massive changes in land use, labor systems, market practices, and social hierarchies. And we're going to explore all of that with the author today. Welcome to Readara.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Fascinating book, very richly detailed and exhaustive in its treatment of the subject. Why did you write a book on tea, which Americans are not very fascinated about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of think about that since I am, of course, a British historian, but I'm very much an American coffee drinker. So it didn't really start with my love of the beverage. I've gained an appreciation having written the book, but didn't start there like many books on commodities. But mainly I was really interested. I'd written, now for really 30 years on the history of consumer society. And my first book was on the history of shopping in Victorian London and how London became a site for women's, like a public space for women. But I tried doing research on tea shops for that book because I thought, well, that's the number one feminine space for Victorian ladies and, Edwardian women in major cities. But there was very few archives, and I wrote a little bit, but ended up kind of laying it aside. And then for a few years, I was trying to figure out a new project and thinking about, it was early 2000s when I started thinking about this. And then I was thinking about topics in the wake of 9/11, actually. And all scholars were thinking about globalization. What did it mean? Was, 2011, how we responded to it, the causes of it, those kinds of issues really started to change scholarship in general. So I was thinking about how consumer culture is a global force in the world and how people have made it a site of protest. Initially I was thinking about that and like critiques of Western culture that happen around the world. But then I was also thinking how almost everything that we consume is global in one way or another. And I had thought, I'll do different foodstuffs and chapters like on different global products. So sugar, coffee, maybe tobacco, tea. And so I thought that tea was going to be a component, but not a whole book. And so I was in the British Library and I was literally messing around, which is often what we do when I had requested material that didn't come in and I had hours to spend. And so I was just like looking through catalogs and found just an interesting entry that said Indian Tea Association. And I went, what's that? Started requesting, material from it and realized that this is 4,000 item archive that came from the Indian growers and growers associations and showed how they, from the mid-19th century, started to sell tea globally. So I started reading about these guys that they hired to go on trade missions, United States, in Europe and Russia, and in Africa. And I just couldn't believe it was so early. I thought those kinds of developments were much later. So I was very intrigued. And I thought, well, I'm a British historian and there's no good book on tea. So then it hit me. It was time. And I thought, this is it. It was one of those light bulb moments like, nope, I'm going to concentrate on tea, in order as almost a lens to study globalization and the processes that, were underway and much longer history. Since tea has been part of European in many cultures for so long, it was a great way, rather than, say, Coca-Cola that started in the 20th century, just naturally allows us to see much longer trajectory.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so what are the origins of tea and why tea is considered wholesome and vital drink?
Well, that's very contentious. It's part of the competition between Chinese scholars and South Asian scholars, but really the origins are in that borderland area between China and other parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia. We still don't know exactly how it moves back and forth between China and India, and there's a huge debate on that. I suspect with plant genetics and things, we'll have a much better sense probably in the next, you could really pinpoint it. But in a sense, it started, thousands of years ago. And really what interested me was not really where the plant comes from, but where the culture of tea comes from. So, that really, we definitely know it was China that developed much, much earlier tea culture. And there's, of course, I'm not a Chinese scholar, and there's great work on Chinese history, so I was really able to kind of rely on really terrific scholarship that has really looked at how tea moved from being a luxury item in China to a mass commodity and a taxed item. And it paid for, what really surprised me is it did everything that it did in England. Paid for wars, helped colonize parts of China. There was forced labor in China. So that's interesting. And of course, again, Chinese scholars have done that work, but I found it really interesting comparison. But what's really also fascinating that I found that was a little bit different. There are scholars who've written on how tea moved from China to other areas of Asia, to across different routes, but across Central Asia to Europe, and also then through maritime trade as well. So there are different routes that it came to Europe. But what really struck me when I started looking at the sources is that Europeans first drank Chinese tea in the empire, in China, in Japan, there were merchants who were drinking tea in Western India, for example, in the 17th century. So I would love to see more scholarship on that earlier history of consumption and think about, how are these merchant cultures really developing new practices? They're drinking coffee too, and putting sugar in their drinks also. So that was really interesting to see. It wasn't that the commodity moved, it's more that Europeans moved east, and then felt that it would be profitable, and they became addicted and start trading and importing tea. But for the British, it may be difficult to accept the fact that the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch were all drinking tea long before them. So that's kind of interesting. And it was those countries where also British, in the 17th century, British elites were in those countries, or, elites and merchants. And they were getting a taste for tea. So it's in the empire, but also in Europe, but not in Britain. Britain was kind of late to the tea story in a sense. They did have coffee at the time, so I'm not too worried about them, in general. It's really interesting that then, at a certain point, it's actually, traders didn't immediately see wealth in tea. So you'd think that they thought, this is addictive, it's a nice drink, easy to transport, and they didn't think that. It was just a byproduct of wanting to get other goods from the East, porcelains and, those kind of silks, much more desirable luxury items. And so even though the merchants were drinking the tea and some others, were kind of interested in it, it was a very slow process, really. Rather it wasn't kind of, I had a cup of tea, it's great, I want to import it and make money off of it. So it was, again, a lot of very individual, very slow, but there's a lot of reasons for that. But the one thing that's different about tea from other commodities is that Europeans were able to transplant, really, production from original locations to areas of the empire for, like, tobacco, for example. You could grow it in the North American colonies. They didn't, and were not able to do that for tea. So it's very interesting. The Chinese had so many laws and protections to keep knowledge about tea growing from the rest of the world. Well into the 19th century, I found it was very surprising that the Europeans, and particularly the British, had no idea really about the plant, how to grow it, how to manufacture tea. It was very, very slow. And that's very different than sugar, tobacco, coffee, all those kinds of other commodities. So I always see it's a late globalizer compared to them, and the Chinese were more responsible for it than the British in that early phase. So then I have a whole chapter, though, finally, when the British, they're obsessed with, of course, as we know, they're obsessed with getting China to trade with them, and, and for that's a very long history, and to get the Chinese to buy some goods that the Chinese don't want to buy in order to acquire tea, because the British became addicted in the early 19th century. So they're obsessed with being able to say, okay, how can we get, have good trade relations with China, have a balance of trade. But at the same time, so we know that led to the Opium Wars, because the British, of course, finally discovered that the Chinese, would consume Indian-grown opium And that was the product that they used to offset the balance of trade for tea. But the Opium Wars are in the early 1830s. At the same time, I didn't focus on that since we have so much work on that opium trade and Opium Wars. I noticed that the British also kept thinking and writing about how can we develop our own, just an alternative source of supply, just break from China entirely. And they were looking for territory, and then, of course, India was the most likely place where the landscape and the climate and the soil looked like China. They're constantly saying, well, we could have our own China, essentially, and grow Chinese tea in our own territory. So there were many botanists and explorers, and turned out to be a soldier that really discovered it, who were looking for a likely locale to grow tea. And they found it when they found tea growing wild in Assam in the Northeast in really the 1820s. So it's quite early, but the scientists wouldn't agree that it actually was a tea plant that they discovered. So it took a while, another 10 years, before they realized this was real tea growing outside of China. So the whole chapter, though, because Assam wasn't part of the British Empire at that time, only parts of it were, and the conquest of Assam, I really believe, was a factor of discovering the tea and months later realizing, oh, we need this territory to be part of the empire. So that's relates to the title, of course, The Thirst for Empire. Found the tea and made it tea growing lands part of the empire, rather than it's just too much of a coincidence. They didn't want Assam necessarily. It was just a border state to protect Bengal until it was just literally months after they agreed that this was tea. Okay, we'll take over this territory. And they started plantations within, the year. So that's all in 1834. It happens very kind of quickly. There's an official declaration that Assam's tea is actual tea. Assam is part of the empire, and the East India Company starts investing in creating the conditions, first, kind of government subsidized industry, really, to create plantations. But most British historians at that point don't realize that although Britain has Assam and they can technically grow tea, the entire 19th century, it's fairly unsuccessful business. And I think that's really one of the key arguments I have in the book, is you have to think about these failures too. So that they're establishing plantations, bringing forced labor from other areas of India, working on figuring out how to grow tea, but they still make a terrible product. And that seems pretty clear from reading retailers' reactions. They'll try to sell it to consumers, and consumers thought the stuff is terrible. It's really, many of them said it tastes like weeds, which I think is very evocative of the fact that it probably was just basically a weed. Unrefined, didn't taste like Chinese tea. It wasn't the same thing at all. So that really intrigued me when I started reading those reports. It's okay, now it took 50 years to figure out how to grow tea, but consumers didn't like this imperial tea. So that, I think, is why you start to get huge sort of publicity infrastructure to change taste. And first to chase, the British already drank massive amounts of tea by the 1870s when this new product was really coming on the market. But they were very determined not to drink the empire's tea, and not care about it. So that was really interesting to think about, the problems that this industry encountered that had to lead them to think about consumers, because consumers were so resistant. And I think in general, I found that scholars of food studies have become very aware of how tastes are very slow and hard to change in the food industry, even though we feel addicted, say, to sugar and, McDonald's, you think, oh, things change quickly. But in fact, consumers are very particular. You get used to certain tastes, and you don't adopt new fashions the way you might in cell phones or, clothing, that kind of thing. People are more reluctant when it comes to foods. So that was really interesting to see how the business kind of started to wrestle with these questions really early on. And so I found that that's when it's like the 1870s, 1880s, you start to see planters, and I call them publicists because I didn't really know what term to use because they really didn't have a profession yet. But planters especially became interested in selling, figuring out, wait a minute, how are we going to get people to adopt our product. And so they had to think about two things. One is, how do you get tea drinkers to change their taste, but also how do you encourage people who don't drink tea to drink tea? So that was a slightly different problem, but they're thinking about that problem quite early. And that's long before the history of marketing starts in an official way. They couldn't do market research, they didn't interview people. So it's really, they go on these like very individual explorations, trade missions, and interview, like talk to retailers around the world, sort of gather very piecemeal information. So I thought that was fascinating that globalization almost is happening at the same time we see the emergence of marketing or advertising, or like as people are trying to figure out market information.
Mm-hmm. Why Europeans got addicted to tea, or why even the consumers were not interested in British Empire or the imperial tea was marketed, but the Chinas, they were comparing with Chinese tea. And so what were the driving forces?
Yeah, and it's not just Europeans, of course, because throughout Asia, Asians are also addicted, and the Asian market for tea was much larger, until the 20th century. But I do think some of it does come down to, a couple of things. One is biology, because it is addictive, and there are many ways you can become addicted to caffeinated tight commodities or stimulants in a sense. But that is definitely, we know that the first products to be globalized were drugs, opium, tobacco, sugar, in some sense. That certainly helped, because once people did acquire not just a taste, but I think the bodily sensation of that stimulating, the sense of the stimulant really helps. But the question is there were people, it's hard to imagine, that lived, especially in Europe, they did not drink stimulants, and it wasn't a big part of their life until really the late 18th, 19th century. So that always intrigued me, because I thought, well, they did work and they did read and all, and live a life. So that's a big change. That's one of the reasons I call that term modernity, because when we make that change from living off of, the British and Americans too, beer and, protein and like oats, to a kind of highly stimulated like diet of sugar, refined wheat, tea, that's the same package of that's really very immediate stimulation, is quite different. But the question of why, there's several things, but one of the aspects that we need to think about is how it fits into people's lifestyles as well. And so tea really takes off in Britain, for example, with the Industrial Revolution. And the argument is, there's a wonderful book, it was one of the first books that started world history, called Sweetness and Power, by Sidney Mintz, who wrote about sugar, is that tea with sugar stimulated the workers, who were in the factories, had those incredibly long hours in the factories. And it was at that time already pretty cheap, very easy to prepare, and helped you just deal with long hours of factory life. I think he's right that tea did start, and I saw it in South Africa and in India and elsewhere in industrial locations. It was very common to be the first tea drinkers in a society, tended to be industrial workers. But I think he's wrong that it was so easy. So when I read further, I found out in the 19th century, it wasn't all that cheap, number one, in comparison to other, home-brewed beer, for example. It was hard to prepare because kitchens aren't the same as they are now, so that heating water, getting water, all that, getting the equipment was quite a time-consuming process. So it can't be called a convenience food in the early 19th century. So that made me think, it's not that easy. And they said it actually took quite a while. The shopping, as opposed to just getting your own home-brewed beer, you had to go buy tea. There's so many activities involved. It used up a lot of time. And people complained about that too. There's elites complaining about working class people wasting time while preparing their tea, But I do think it's the factory owners came to believe tea was really good for their workers, and they really pushed it. And so the factory owners started to see that it would keep their workers off of alcohol. And everywhere you see tea promoted, it's presented as a temperate beverage that would keep you from being, drunk at work, basically. And so I saw that again, later in India, it's constantly promoted as a temperate beverage. If you drink this, you won't drink beer, and you'll behave yourself and rise up in your social station. And that's all coming from the owners of the factories who are trying to encourage this temperate, new, modern worker. And then the workers do get addicted, and that's just sort of, they give them tea free, the factory owners. So I have a whole chapter on temperance tea parties, because it's really the factory owners that are hosting a lot of those, and factory workers hosting tea parties that are giving people tea for free, telling them you'll have a wonderful marriage because you won't get into fights with your husband, for example. If you drink tea, they won't have a drunken husband. You'll get into heaven because you won't sin. There's all these kind of, I call it a sacred commodity. Tea comes to be seen as laden with all these associations in Britain with evangelical Christianity. I'm not sure that the workers necessarily accepted it, but I think they loved the free food. This is a time where people are very hungry, and they also gave them free bread, sugary foods, fruit, So it came along with the whole package that we now associate with afternoon tea. So I do think it's like this industrial communities that were really important. And then literally everywhere you look, almost in the British Empire, factory workers are being told this is good for you. At the same time, also armies, I think, are really important and spread taste. So it's not where we might think. But that's why I had the soldiers on the cover. I really wanted soldiers on the cover of the book, because armies are really important in spreading taste. And of course, they are seen by later in the 20th century, we see them as markets that can spread new tastes, and it's famous that Coca-Cola used the American Army to spread Coke throughout the world and build factories for Coke and that sort of thing. But tea did it too. And so a lot of army officials started, and Navy and others also started to think, oh, we'll have a sober soldier who can fight, or a sober sailor, and that it's good, it's healthy. And so they spread these tastes around. And that's really important in India, I think. The Indian Army, you have many references. Of course, I couldn't fit them all in the book, where you see planters trying to get the Indian Army, different regiments, to have tea rooms, teach soldiers to drink tea, be sober, good fighters. So that was really interesting to think about these kind of the mechanisms through which tea spreads in a society and the institutions, and they're not just shops. And that became really clear to me. The thought, my first book was looking at department stores a lot, and they are very important institutions that spread new tastes, but that's the end of the story, really.
Yeah, and there were also slogans invented like tea revives you, and the other one is that there is health in good tea.
Oh, yes. And that was really debated. So it becomes, I argue it's one of the longest lasting sales pitches in history, that, this is a healthy beverage and it will make you feel better and cure all your ailments. And being sober and temperate was part of that. When they're starting to argue that being sober is healthy as well, so it's kind of mixed with it. But not everybody accepted that idea at first. A lot of people thought that tea was dangerous and could make you overstimulated. You'd have nervous disorders, those kinds of things, or that it was bad for your stomach. The ideas of health have changed a lot. So tea is sold as healthy, but it's not clear what people meant at any given time and place, what healthy meant. And then I thought what was really interesting, I have ended up with a chapter on adulteration of tea, because though it was sold as healthy, the actual tea wasn't. So that was very interesting that in the 19th century, and of course we deal with food-borne illness and adulteration still very much today, but in the 19th century, the tea was adulterated with poisonous chemicals quite often, sometimes not just dirt and tea dust and things from the factory floor, but many importers, but also the British blamed the Chinese. They thought they were poisoning them with these things like black lead to make the tea darker, other kinds of dangerous additives of all sorts. So it's a very unregulated industry. So in a sense, tea wasn't healthy in the 19th century. And so I think it's fascinating that the advertising is selling it as healthy, but in practical terms, you don't know what you're getting when you're importing and drinking tea. I argue that's one of the first real moments of anxiety about globalization, because the British and Americans and others that are drinking Chinese tea are drinking a foreign good. We don't know what's in that, what's in the tea. And it's the Chinese, they are touching our tea, so the real anxiety about China kind of started to circulate around tea, which certainly helped the Indian tea producers would say, our tea is pure. So healthier than the Chinese.
So how did the industry and empire got intertwined, as you kind of deal in the chapter 5? I like the fascinating thing is that you mentioned manufacturing imperial tastes.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, just most people think the tea is grown, but here is manufactured. So obviously there are processes involved, but I'll let you explain that how empire come to rely on tea as industry and how tea industry fueled the global ambitions of the empire and colonization.
Right. So, yeah, there are definitely scholars that know that, institutions like the East India Company helped create the plantations in India and, secure the beginnings of the industry. But I ended up arguing, it became clearer and clearer to me that it wasn't companies so much like we think of today, like Twinings or Lipton's or, those branded goods that help spread the imperial taste, although they come later. They do ultimately. But initially, it was planters who were growing the tea, discovering quickly that, as they put it, they thought their market was basically satisfied, but they used a term like full. Like you satiated, you could not possibly drink more tea. So they had to think about, well, what would make people drink more beverage, than they're used to, and then also spread the taste elsewhere. So there's lots of debates on people in the late 19th century. The British were getting very excited about their empire. There starts to be a lot of imperial propaganda around efforts to get the working class to be imperialistic and nationalistic. And so a lot of the advertising said, well, we'll try selling it as an imperial good so that, unlike coffee, which at that time there was coffee grown in the empire, but not as much, and coffee comes from many places outside the empire. This is the good that, now the British control and other places don't. And so instead of buying Chinese tea, if you buy Indian tea, you're buying and supporting the economics of empire. So advertising, I was really surprised how explicit it was about that. But it was largely advertising from planters to retailers. We're telling retailers, stock these teas, you're going to support the empire. You're a grocer, and that's not very socially high position, but you can support the empire. And so the grocers start to think that way, but they also have the problem of consumers not liking the imperial tea. So it's interesting. I thought, just selling something as imperial didn't really work. So sometimes the grocers hid the imperial tea, and they didn't advertise it as imperial. They'd advertise imperial tea or Indian tea as Chinese, mix it in blends, try to convince people that, not let them know what they were consuming. So there was an effort to generate enthusiasm, or what we might call like nationalistic buying habits, but it never was a very successful project, I guess I would say, until the very end of the century, when something like Lipton's really takes off and he starts to market. He has those famous advertisements of advertising himself as importing direct from the, plantation to the, as he put it, from the seed to the cup. So Lipton's had really blanketed the UK and then other areas too, including India at the same time, and the United States, with this kind of pro-empire imagery. And that really, I don't know that, I still question to the degree which working class people care more about cost and nationalism. Were moved by that, but he advertised that way for decades. And then the company picked up and kept it up, that you're supporting the empire if you drink this tea. So consumers were feeling like they're brought into the empire. And then, of course, other marketers thought, this is successful, we need to do it too. And it was, continued through the 1920s into the 1930s, really, that strategy of telling people, you can, through your small purchases, you can help the economy of this great empire.
What is fascinating about this story is that the British Empire or the East India Corporation used Indian product grown in India and Assam and the foothills of Assam, and then sold it in the Europe or Britain, primarily in Britain first, and used that money to actually propagate their power over the control of the Indian people in India.
Yes, yeah. So it worked there are different estimates of the amount of profit that came from tea. So it's the profit from the actual growing and selling of tea, but also the taxation of tea was always an issue. So the British tended to raise taxes on tea when they were fighting a war. So that would have been, of course, earlier wars in the 19th century, but also the South African War in the turn of the century is a big moment when taxation of tea, again, paid for war, paid for conquering a part of the empire. So it's not just India, but the broad global reach, how they accrued these huge I don't know, the kind of, well, really the infrastructure, but also just the money to pay for that tremendous Navy, to pay for the Indian Army, those kinds of things, so that we know ultimately it led to a backlash because consumption couldn't keep up with the cost of military might. But, and so like by the time you get to World War I, World War II, all states had to figure out more complex ways to pay for empires. But it certainly worked up till that point.
A long time it worked in their favor, yes.
Yeah, a long time. Centuries, really.
Yeah, and the imperial stretch came very, very too late.
Yeah, exactly. And, the other thing that makes me think of is that ultimately it's in the state's interest to spread consumption of these cheap products, whatever that can be taxed. So coffee was taxed too, sugar. But since it's largely, they don't yet have an income tax, you're taxing items on consumption, but you need mass consumption to make that work. So that's where I was thinking the history of consumption and empire intertwine, because mass consumption is paying for empire, and then empire is getting the products to pay now that people are consuming. So it's a circle,
And what were the foreign markets that these planters were going after, as you say, towards the end of the century?
Yeah, so it's right around the turn of the century. The planters, it's great because they start publishing a lot of newspapers where they share ideas to themselves, and you can see their anxiety. So they start talking about how they have surpluses, as do many agricultural products in the end of the 19th century. What do we do with this tea? How are we going to solve it? So then, they definitely said we need to advertise and pay for advertising. That will help. But there's a lot of debates about where they should go. And what really fascinated me was a debate between, there were planters who were very enthusiastic about the United States, and then planters who were very enthusiastic about India. And I started thinking, and often it would be in the same article, or letters to the editor fighting it out. Like, no, India makes more sense. No, the United States makes more sense. But in both cases, I think they were fantasized about the size of the populations in those two locations, and they described them both in terms of tea as underdeveloped markets. That is, this is a cheap good, we can sell it cheaply, and neither Indians nor people in the United States drink enough tea. So I thought that was, really interesting. And so they do both, and sometimes the same marketer would work in India and the United States. And I thought, oh, God, that's really shakes up my sense of the world, of how globalization seems so much earlier than as they're working out these problems, that they're much more successful in India than the United States, as you might imagine, in looking at today's world. And I sort of had to think I write a lot about the United States, partly because I was so fascinated by how Indian, and then later when Indian business people took over, they still had the same obsession that we just get the U.S. to drink more tea, our entire economy will be, problems in the industry will be solved. And it's a big, wealthy market. Americans, they would say, already in the 1880s, they said, they love to consume things, they love advertising, they love new things, we just have to get there and get the product to them. And over again, the Americans said, we don't like this. It was just amazing. And the same rhetoric would come up. Starting in the 20s, you see, they'd say, it's an English drink for grannies for when you're sick. And then also, which I couldn't believe, they'd say it's effeminate. Americans really said that a lot. It's for women, men don't drink tea. And then even in the 20s, I started seeing rhetoric saying essentially that they'd say mollycoddles drink tea, which was a slang for gay men. So I thought, oh my God, they're already saying this product is gay. And I thought, that's probably what Americans think of British people in general. So I think that, at that point, it was just so funny. And then so the tea researchers would say, okay, all we have to do is make tea look masculine. So there's all this advertising of lumberjacks drinking tea, athletes, football players. So that just fascinated me. And it's an example, though, that the advertising didn't work at all in the United States. But I kind of argue that failure taught the industry a lot, about what kinds of people drink tea, how to advertise. They still believed in it. So they kept pumping millions of dollars into the U.S. market. And you still, it's an important market in the sense that we are a large market. And there is a lot of tea imported in the United States, but per capita consumption didn't really ever increase. So that's really, it was like a huge failure. Whereas in India, of course, people didn't really drink tea until the World War I is a big break where you start to see mass markets in tea. So it's a 20th century phenomenon. and really takes off. And I'm still fascinated to think about why is it after independence that consumption even increases more when it was possible to sort of give up on this industry that everybody thought was colonial and not good for India. But by that time, Indians were addicted too. You know?
And yet, every kitchen is a empire's kitchen. I think that was so. What was the politics of imperial consumerism as you explained more in the chapter 7?
Yeah, so that happened. That chapter 7 revolves around the 1930s, which ultimately I came to realize, and I think this is true for the history of consumer society in general, is of course the Great Depression and global anxieties about the collapse of the global economy. And so it was a moment that I think actually, of course, replayed in 2007, 8, 9, where you could see the connections of the global economy because it collapsed together. So there were lots of efforts, and I focused on Britain, but also India, on the tea industry, which was failing miserably in that period, though consumers were drinking more tea in that period than ever before. So I found this great, very thorough report in the 1930s saying that the British Empire controlled 2/3 of all production of tea in the global, that's traded globally, 2/3 of all consumption, and then many of the related industries like shipping, insurance, it was like really dominated by the 1930s. So it was a British problem when the industry starts to fail. And at that point, then you see the conservative, kind of what I call a kind of grassroots conservative tradition that seems almost like it's a populist tradition, starting to argue, we need to consume British products only and kind of insulate ourselves from the global economy and only consume empire goods. This is coming both from, I think, grassroots political groups in Britain and elsewhere. It's happening in other places too. Italy is the best example in the 1930s, where Mussolini tried to cut Italy off from global markets and encourage Italians to just consume Italian wheat and Italian wine. And, so we have that effort to, and of course in the U.S., buy American, buy Italian. But in Britain, what was interesting was it was a huge debate between different wings of the Conservative Party. And so a lot of conservative women were really angry at retailers for not just stocking empire goods. And that was amazing to me. I found women really getting involved in consumer activism, pushing the big companies like Lipton's, and Brook Bond is a really big, at that time, was a huge importer of tea, saying to their, the companies, you're not sufficiently patriotic, and you need to only source global goods. Whereas in that time, the multinationals are sourcing from Dutch sources and other sources, whatever's cheap. So it was interesting that consumers start really developing a voice, but it's a right-wing consumer activism, not a left-wing one. And then at the same time, that's the point where anti-nationalist protests are really taking off in India. So Indians are getting, very boycotting European goods and debating whether they should boycott tea as well. That was tougher than cotton because, unlike cotton, a lot of Indians owned plantations at that point in the 1930s. So it was, Indian nationalists would say, tea is a British good that we need to protect our people from. They also recognize there's a lot of Indian investment in the industry. So ultimately, there are boycotts, there are protests, and they found some great discussions of parliament, debates, political debates between Indian nationalists and politicians. Should we give up on this good? But in the end, I'm addicted to tea, and our whole society is addicted to tea, so we can't give up on it. So, they recognized so much that it wasn't good for India, but yet at the same time, they thought, if we take over the plantations and the businesses, we can keep the tea. Many politicians even joked. The funniest joke, there were two jokes that were really funny. One saying, I think tea is so bad for Indian workers. It's, you can't buy food, blah, blah, blah. But I found out I couldn't give it up when I was in prison. He was a nationalist and in prison, and he said I was forced to give it up, and it was the worst. I was tortured, And then another politician was saying, we got it. And he's joking because a lot of the nationalists were pro what we now call almost local goods, right, using Swadeshi Indian traditional goods. And said, we should go back to drinking Bang, which is a drink made with cannabis. And he said, not only would it be traditional, and he almost put it in quotes, like a joke, but he said, we wouldn't be revolutionaries because, tea makes you difficult to deal with. And obviously marijuana sedates you.
Sedates you, yes.
And it's none 1930s, they were joking about this. So I thought that was really funny.
The salt, the cotton, the tea, and these were the parts of the global commerce trade that the empire controlled and built the colonies on it. And then the tea also had a similar history. But tea revives the world, especially during the Depression time, when it was selling vitality.
Yeah, and at that point, I argue it's almost like the empire is not a big enough entity for this industry. And we start to see more formal forms of marketing institutions that are then saying we better go globally outside of the empire too. So in Europe, parts of they think about South America, but they start to realize that's coffee country and not worth it. But places of like Sweden, for example, Belgium, parts of Africa, they're starting to think about creating consumer markets. So it's arising out of that global depression where they realize like this is a global industry. And I ultimately argue that puts an end to that imperial rhetoric, of selling this is an empire good, British good. In the late 30s, there are new institutions, and they seemed at first to me very boring, but then I found them fascinating. There are these international marketing boards, various terms for them, Indian Tea Marketing Board, International Tea Marketing Expansion Board, those kinds of things. That are they use taxes from tea exports to pay for global advertising. But even though that's an imperial entity, and they were all funded by imperial producers and growers, they start to downplay in the late 30s tea's imperial image and just make it like, I argue, a cheerful pick-me-up, that it revives you. It's like this harmless little, harmless drink, doesn't have any imperial history, but it makes you feel good, and it's just like, homey, innocent, I guess, in a way, and so still as opposed to alcohol always is in the back of their minds. But they invented he was an icon that was like the producers described it, like the Guinness Toucan, which is still famous, or Johnny Walker, but a little teapot called Mr. Teapot. He's a little jovial guy, and they branded him all over in these global marketing campaigns. So he didn't look much like an imperial soldier or it was just very generic, and then you just slightly dressed him differently in different cultures. So in Belgium, they put a little beret on him, they kind of slightly, or in...
Localized.
Yeah, you localize this global icon, but it's a very simple little cartoon. And that's the time where a lot of cartoons are used for advertising, and Disney starting, so it sort of also made it a bit childish, but less scary, less imperial.
So as the tea, which was imperial product for the support of the imperial domination, finally ran out of the market, so it had to be taken outside of the empire, and it finds more and more markets. Japan has been drinking green tea and tea many years. Where Japan fell into all these things?
It's funny. It's like the British. So Japan, I read a lot about Japan. I went there too, and went to the plantations and went to a tea museum. But I think Japan is a really different story, because the British, in the United States, Americans drank Japanese green tea, but almost no Japanese tea was ever imported into Great Britain or the colonies. There were different supply chains. So in the United States, the British are fighting, in a sense, Japanese tea, but Japanese had just exactly the same marketing institutions as the British. There's really a parallel story, because the Japanese would argue their tea was pure and unadulterated, unlike Chinese tea, so they still used anti-Chinese rhetoric. They had Japanese tea associations, and in fact, the thing that really amazed me was, I guess it was about 3 years ago, I was in Japan, and I went to a tea and silk museum, and when I walked in the door, I saw a display from the Japanese Tea Association where they were brewing chai, trying to teach Japanese about chai, but showing them that the tea came from Kenya. And I was like, oh, this is globalization. These are my people, but they're, a different trajectory. It was so fascinating. I met them and we talked a lot. It was really interesting. It was delicious chai. Didn't taste like chai I'd had in India, though. But, that the story goes on, it kind of continues. But the Japanese, they hired, as early as the 20s, they hired J. Walter Thompson to advertise in the United States. And, have big marketing campaigns. And in the U.S., U.S. sort of, elite bohemians were really taken with Japan in the late 19th century. So they thought that they were, this was kind of a luxury item, and it was successful. But ultimately, in the later 20th century, the marketers that I look at sort of pushed people to drink more Indian black tea and less green tea in the U.S. So they were successful at that, but they never increased their consumption. And so that's why now green tea's had a comeback, but, until about, a decade, 15 years ago, there wasn't much green tea anymore in the U.S., and I think that's partly due to my people. But there would be a lot more written because the Japanese are very aggressive advertisers. It would be a great example of a non-Western country using these same techniques to globalize their products.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In India, Darjeeling tea is revered for its flavor and fragrance and its, therapeutic properties as well. And still, most of the people outside of India still haven't understood or discovered the taste of Darjeeling tea because it was always sold as an Assami tea or imperial tea that came primarily from Assam.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was just thinking about that because, there's currently, Darjeeling is currently cut off from global markets, Darjeeling tea, because of the Gorkhaland agitation that's has been going on all summer. So I've been thinking a lot about, how much Darjeeling's always been an export tea, but it is special. It has it's the only tea grown in India that is originally from Chinese variety plants, not a mixture or from the Indian variety, and often not drunk with milk and sugar, right? It's sort of cherished for its lighter, for that more floral flavor that you would cover up. And so I was wondering when that happened, because it was initially the plantation started there early in the 1850s, and it did initially get blended into Twinings and all the other, it was just one of many different new kinds of teas that are coming on the market. But then when did they establish their distinctive, image of Darjeeling tea and flavor? And I think that's been more recent than we think. And I started thinking, it's really more mid-20th century, I think, where once India is independent, then the different regions start to compete with each other. It's not all Indian tea, but the different, parts. But you're right that Darjeeling tea is still a tea associated with connoisseurship, and that's why even the people who do drink it in the United States are tea drinkers. They really know their teas.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it has I always think it's associated with the place too, and the tourism. Tea and tourism are really linked in Darjeeling in a way. Of course, Assam just doesn't have the same. We think of tea grown in the hills, but it's grown in the plains and the foothills there, so it's doesn't have the beauty or the aura of Darjeeling tea.
The rivalry between champagne and the California sparkling wine is similar here between the Darjeeling tea and the Chinese tea as well.
Yeah.
And there's a global market for all these products.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few products that particular cheeses I think would be similar, where they say, you can only have real champagne is from Champagne, and that, in France. Now, what's interesting is the things like World Trade Organization and other global regulators have actually legally enshrined that, so you can't advertise your tea as Darjeeling-like. It has to be from Darjeeling, grown in Darjeeling, produced in Darjeeling. And that, to me, that's recent. They only really got those legal protections in the last several decades. But the idea of, they used to use that phrase, Darjeeling is a champagne of teas. I saw that as early as the 1920s and 30s you start to see it. But it really takes off more, I think, at independence, the 50s and 60s, where there's a Darjeeling Tea Association that's really marketing its own brands. It's a little bit of all of a fiction because it's the same companies that own, we think of planters as owning those plantations, as individual owners, but they're multinational corporations that do. So in my mind, it's probably the same owners that own a lot of the plantations in Darjeeling that own them elsewhere, but they're marketing it as a sort of specialty product, luxury product.
Even Sri Lanka has some of the finest tea in the world too.
Yeah. Sri Lanka is a very interesting story because their tea industry starts a little bit later. It takes off first teas from what they then called Ceylon, and actually tea is still associated. If it's from Sri Lanka, you use the term Ceylon. They kept the brand. The first teas from there really came on the markets in the very end of the 1880s. You see them in the 1890s. And then I was fascinated. The planters there were the most sophisticated advertisers. They're way ahead of India in getting their teas in global markets. And, it's partly that it was a smaller community and they knew each other, and they relied a lot on their, they had, local newspapers, like one of them's the Ceylon Observer. The editors in the newspapers became advertisers and publicists for their products and really sold Ceylon's goods as opposed to India. So at various exhibitions, the Ceylon planters say, we don't want to be mixed with India in the display. Like, we want our own place, our own exhibit. And it really bugged the Indian planters. They're like, God, now we have to advertise because they're doing it. So already it was the big fight came with the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It was a huge event for globalization. But in the Ceylon producers were like, we cannot be anywhere near India. I thought that was fascinating because they really wanted to distinguish themselves as almost like a nation before there was anything like that, that had very distinctive identity. And at times then in the Depression, they would work with India, when things were really bad. But then after independence, I found even though the country said, oh, we're going to get rid of British business and we're going to be socialist and we're not going to do all this, they were the most aggressive advertisers you could possibly imagine in the 1960s. And I found they're advertising Ceylon tea everywhere in the mid-60s and really establishing an image for Ceylon as a distinctive new country and with these special products. And that still carried the weight because it still has more value than a lot of the mass market Indian teas.
And then in the late, after the Second World War, in the late 40s, the World War is over, the Allies win over Germany and their allies. And yet Britain is in complete financial ruin. And as a result, the empire starts dissolving. They couldn't even repay some of the debt to the United States.
Right.
And little by little, over the next decade, most of the empire is dissolved. So what happens to the tea, as you call it, leftovers?
Yeah, the last part of the book, I became very interested in that story of what happens to tea after empire when you don't have those supports. And the empire itself is just a shadow of its former self. It's really interesting. So what ultimately happens, though, is, and scholars will say this a lot, so you have political severing of empire if you're talking about India in, the late 40s, Africa and in the 50s and 60s. But these economic relationships that have been built don't sever very easily. And that becomes a problem for African and Indian governments and politicians. How do you break away? We're still dependent on these economies in the West, both as investors, but also as consumer markets and others. So they're really thinking about that problem just as you phrased it. What do we do? And what I found is it was a very slow unraveling, much slower than you would think. At first, what happened is all the planters that were in India and in Ceylon, which it was still called Ceylon, many of them basically picked up and went to Africa and started really investing in the African industry. So in Kenya and Cameroon, other parts of Africa, there had been some African plantations, even South Africa had some in the turn of the century, and then in the 20s, a few companies. But it's really huge growth in the 50s. And they developed new marketing structures like local auctions and warehousing and packing plants. So African industry really takes off as a result of what's going on with South Asia. And today, most consumers don't realize most of the black Indian style tea we drink comes from Africa. It's still, Kenya became at one point, it varies, they kind of trade off, one of the major exporters of black tea. And so it's still an imperial story because it's like that very late empire. But then, of course, quickly the British had to leave Africa too. So they plant a lot of investments in Africa, and it's newer plants, newer methods. So it does really well. And that also hurts India tremendously. So one of the things that happens in particular to India that I got fascinated with, and there wasn't really any work on, was that when India was partitioned in the Northeast, between what was then, initially it was East Pakistan and then became Bangladesh, that partition was right through the trade routes that the tea from Assam went to market, and actually through some plantations and things. So India really suffered in particular because of the, as planters and others are saying, we have to go through a foreign country to get our tea to market. So Sri Lanka did well at that time because it didn't have that problem, and then the African industry did really well. So I think India economically really suffered because of the nature of independence and partition. And that really fascinated me as there's evidence that the British also didn't reinvest at all in the plants and just let them grow to, get weedy and not be well taken care of. So in the last few years when they saw independence coming, so that was a problem. But then the other interesting thing is that consumption in Britain, this is why I ended up having to write about this period and make the book so long, is consumption started to decline in Britain, Australia, Canada, what they call the white settler colonies, right at the same moment of decolonization in the mid-50s. Like, around 1957, 58, British planters and the tea interests were like panicking because consumption is declining now, along with empire, and they relate the two. And so that, again, reinforced my theme that consumerism and empire were really intertwined. But it's a complicated story why it declined. I'm still sort of pondering that and kind of want to think about it even more because, of course, it doesn't decline in places like India or Africa. Consumption really increases, the Middle East. So it's not that tea declines in a broad sense, but it declines in the old consumer empires. Teenagers start seeing it as really fussy and old-fashioned, and they don't want it anymore. It's an old good. But I think they did associate it with imperialism. A lot of them didn't want to be consuming anything to do with the empire. Of course, the irony is they consume things related to new empires like Coca-Cola, and don't recognize it as an imperial good, So that, it's a really interesting, it's such a parallel fascination that consumption really notably declines. It's still declining today because people don't have the supports. There's no institutional supports anymore to drink tea. You're not drinking a product of that you feel your relatives are producing. But at that point, I think there is a lot to do with the rise of American global influences. Huge amount of advertising, for example, for instant coffee, Nescafe. Changes taste, or I argue the same companies. The kind of irony is, I think my favorite one is that, J. Lyons, which was a company that established the first tea shop in the 1890s in London, turns a tea shop into a Wimpy Burger hamburger joint in the 1950s. And Wimpy Burgers are terrible, but it was a British version of McDonald's, and fast food. And people start developing, young people, totally different kind of lifestyle and taste and social life. And so they want to go to have hamburgers, go to coffee bars. They don't have the taste for the tea culture anymore.
So the axis of globalization changes, and with that change in axis, the taste follow as well, though slowly, but it does. With the demise, with the slow decline in tea, and the coffee rises, and with its own marketing, with the Coca-Cola and other products like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and other beverages take over.
Yes, exactly. I like that you put that axis of globalization. It's still absolutely there, but in the different entities are over. And it really is, you can see in parts of the world, like the Soviet Union's influencing trade relations and taste, but certainly in Europe and places like Canada, Australia, the American influences, and people are desiring a new form of global, new kinds of global goods, and tea everywhere. People are saying it's just old-fashioned, it's not with it, it's not cool. And that's why I ended the book, though, with the tea industry's response to that, of trying to make tea hip. And I just thought that was so ridiculous because tea had so much weight from the Victorian, past, from empire, or as people put it, it's something, you drank during the war when you were being bombed. Not for this new age. And so I thought that was hysterical, just seeing this really kind of crazy global campaign to make tea, use San Francisco style rock and roll graphics to sell tea. Just seemed like a lot of money. It shows you how difficult it is to really, when something really changes, to use advertising, because it didn't work. So very recently, there's a few people who think tea is hip, but it wasn't,
It wasn't until a while ago. And of course, you can see it in real life every day. I mean, even mighty Starbucks was forced to announce the shutdown of Tijuana.
Oh, yeah. And right. That it did not work, and despite the emphasis, they have, as you say, so many resources to create this market. So when the structures, I really am interested in advertising works when all these other structures are in place, but not by itself. Really, it's very difficult to fight, especially in the food industry. And that's why actually there's so much advertising in the food industry, because it's very hard to change taste when people start to really lose them and they don't have those other structures. How many people some people buy tea at Starbucks, but not many. And actually tea's consumption's declining in India too. Now coffee's going up, and in Japan. So there's phases, it seems, of, when, especially it seems to be young people turning to new global goods. And the industry goes, I'm interested in how does an industry respond to that? That made me think, though, the 1960s we characterize as like the growth of this globalization, new world. And I said, yeah, for some people, but for the tea industry, it certainly wasn't. It worked for rock and roll, but there's old commodities that really suffered during that time. So it's a reorientation of globalization rather than a new kind of phase,
In the last 2 decades, the only tea that has succeeded in this market has been iced tea.
Yeah, that's true. And people ask me, especially in the United States, they ask me about iced tea all the time. And because it's especially associated with the American South, and in the South, when you get iced tea, it's very sugared and it's got this particular culture and huge amounts, and you can get refills. And I did end up finding that that's true. There was, though I'm not sure when it really took off in the South, I've not found any records that indicate, that measured per capita consumption. So I can't really say, but I did find a tea map of iced tea map of the United States it was done in the 30s, and you could see there was a lot of iced tea in warm climates, so the Western U.S. or the South, and that's because one of the really surprising but fun things I discovered was that the Indian tea producers started a joint campaign with Sunkist growers, who are based really near me here in California, and Domino Sugar, which was a big sugar industry based in the East Coast. Starting in the 1920s, they had a joint marketing campaign for iced tea from the 20s at least through the 60s. And then, so decades of advertising the iced tea as an American drink, an American invention. And unlike hot tea, and that's how they finally broke into the American market, it wasn't through hot tea, but through this sugary, always, the ads always had a beautiful glass pitcher or a glass with ice, which is also a very American commodity. You need all the things that you need for ice. Americans had, like electricity, big freezers, that kind of thing. So, like the ice, the picture of the lemon, the sugar, and then, like this very, like distinctive material culture, very, and they'd have pictures of American flags and what have you. But actually, I did find iced tea was drunk in India in the turn of the century, and there's some recipes for it in old American cookbooks in the late 19th century. But it's the addition of lemon and sugar that got particularly, I guess lemons weren't very popular until that point. It's really interesting to think how that became popular fruit, in baking and in drinks. And lemonade also was part of this campaign for very sweetened. But I know that it was always advertised in the summer as an escape from the heat, a summertime drink. And then in the South, it became a really fixed drink year-round. And then, of course, now it's just year-round, too. It's also big business that Coke owns. And the tea companies, they're all one thing now. But they did do it in India, you could see, but you don't have the ice, for example. It's harder to produce all those equipment you need to make iced tea.
Fascinating story of tea, which is obviously not finished. As the world turns and the people compete for different beverages, hot or cold, the tea will find its place. It will keep changing. Today it's Coke, tomorrow it could be tea again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time. It was fascinating and what a fascinating discussion, and also an enormous amount of work has gone into the scholarly production of collecting data and putting it all together. To obviously, how many years it took to put it all together?
I started the research in 2004, so it was a dozen years more, give or take. It was like a long process. At times I felt I had bitten off more than I could chew.
But certainly well worth it. Certainly well worth it.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.